It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I wanted to start by not only honoring the people who have lived here for many, many generations, but also the place itself. This is a very powerful landscape to wander into, and I know everyone here feels that in their own way, so thank you to this place as well. And I did want to thank Melanie and John, and I know there's dozens of other people behind the scenes who have helped make this a success. It's really a great delight to sort of fall in here in this wonderful tradition here. I've been very, very impressed the more I've learned about what has happened here over the years, so I'm delighted to be here. I am going to talk about how to save the world. That may seem incongruous with the notion of natural history. I suspect everybody in the room has heard that term and probably has their own sense of what that might mean. In many cases, probably rather vague. In many cases, probably aligned with some sixth grade field trip to a dusty museum. But I'm going to try to convince you that natural history is not about the past, it's about the present moment. And as such, it is extremely relevant to who we are as people and what the world is and how we bring those together in the most meaningful and healing way possible. And thus the again, seemingly implausible assertion that natural history, the practice of natural history, might have some essential role to play in healing the world and healing ourselves, those two forms of healing being completely and intricately interlaced, I believe strongly. So, I just wanted to start with two assumptions that I'll be operating from. The first is this, that the earth is a gift, not a problem. And this came to my mind a few years back. I was asked to be a keynote speaker for an Earth Week, and I realized I was the final speaker of a week of Earth Day type activities, and I realized that every other talk that had come that week was about how messed up the world was and what a problem we are living in. And obviously there's truth in all of that, but I think we sometimes lose sight of what an incredible gift it is to live on this planet and to witness the things we do every day. So I was just putting that front and center. And related to that directly is this idea that loving the world is every bit as important as grieving for it. And so let's explore these worlds. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with E.O. Wilson's term he coined, biophilia, which he defines this way: the urge to affiliate with other forms of life. And I believe our deepest affinity is ultimately with the web of life that surrounds us. But again, this idea that loving the world matters, and part of my mission in the last few years has been to kind of reclaim and proudly wave the banner of the term and the notion of love, and the idea, and especially amongst my scientific colleagues, that we shouldn't be dancing away from this idea. We should be running towards it and holding it high, because this is absolutely entwined with our care of the world and our care of ourselves. So, what fosters love of the world? Well, many, many things, an infinite number of things, depending who we are and where we are. And so I'm just going to fly through a number of images here of places I've been and things that I have fallen head over heels for. But everyone here in this room, these are from places off of all sorts of trips and so on, but you don't have to go to spectacular distant lands or see exotic animals or plants necessarily to be in love with the world. And it's organisms, it's landscapes, it's wet places, it's dry places, it's together with other people, it's by ourselves, it's groups of organisms together in groups or by themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And as I say, every person in this room could come up with their own set of slides or their notions here of what are the opportunities for love that we have encountered, but they're endless, and we should not ignore those or take those for granted. When we live in a world that has things like all of these what you're seeing here, and again, all the hundreds of others that we might conjure up together as a group, it's I think, almost criminal if we don't take stock of that and realize how significant that actually is. So, I am going to go through a little bit of defining what natural history is to me and to others, but more recently I've taken to defining it in this way, that natural history on one level is the practice of falling in love with the world. And in fact, there's many, and they might even say that the practice of natural history is love. John Tarrant, who is a Buddhist psychologist, actually wrote this, that attention is the most basic form of love. And as you'll see, I think attention and attentiveness is everything to do with what natural history is. Marge Piercy, poet and novelist extraordinaire, again says attention is love. And we've heard a lot about attention this morning and in various things. And so I'm also hoping to try to stitch together some of the various themes that have been coming forward here. The biologist Chris Normant has coined this term of sympathetic observation, which I think is neat, that the idea that we can be careful, accurate field observers, but still have this sense of compassion and sympathy for the world. So, a little bit more, in a little bit more detail then, what is natural history? Well, the term natural history is about 2,000 years old. It was first in Latin, Historia Naturalis, coined by Pliny the Elder, a writer and philosopher, right around the same time as Jesus. He compiled the Historia Naturalis, was the first encyclopedia. It was the first attempt anybody ever made to assemble everything that humans knew about everything. It's a multi-volume thing. Parts of it are still in print today, and very, very interdisciplinary, not making false dichotomies between what mattered and what didn't. But Historia Naturalis, sometimes the term is confusing to people because history sounds like it's just about the past, but historia means, besides meaning history, also means story. So I think a better interpretation of that is that natural history is the story of nature. But of course, in any given place, in any given moment, there's really an almost infinite number of stories that we could choose to pay attention to. And so there's always that choice, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, a conundrum about which intriguing stories we pay attention to. These are a few of many, many different more formal definitions that have been made. Mostly, these are all by evolutionary biologists. Won't go through them in detail, but notice that observation is really key to pretty much all of these. This is the right answer to what is natural history. This is the definition that I coined a number of years ago, which is a more expansive idea of what natural history is. So a practice of intentional, focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. So it's a practice, it's a doing. And intention, focus, and attentiveness is key to this. And more than human world, a term coined by David Abram and others, is to try to highlight the idea that there's not a dichotomy between human and other. So the term non-human nature niggled many of us because it highlighted the dichotomy instead of the integration. So natural history can focus on people as well as other people. So at the root, natural history really is the practice of paying attention. And another way of thinking of that is that natural history is a verb, not a noun. There's nouns involved with it. We have collections in my institution as an herbarium of many thousand plant specimens and so on and so forth, all of which is wonderful and really important. But I think the most important idea and the root of what natural history really is, and the way I'm talking about here today, is that it's a practice, it's a doing, it's the actual paying attention, the practice of attentiveness. And we are all wired to practice natural history, if you accept this more expansive definition, which is to say, We are designed by evolution, and we heard some great stuff about this morning. We're designed to pay attention. We are designed, our eyes are, we have binocular vision for a reason. We have ears on the side of our head in different ways. We're mobile and are able to touch and taste, as some of us were doing this afternoon, and so on. So we are all born, and I mean this actually quite literally, that we're born to practice natural history. We're born to engage in a practice of attentiveness. And if you doubt that, I would put forth as Exhibit A in my counter-argument to go check out any toddler on planet Earth, regardless of culture, race, any of those kinds of human delineations, and watch what they do. And every child in the world picks up stones, turns them over, puts them in their mouths, looks at things, and that's what we're born to do. We've had to be taught by our culture that when you get to a certain point in your life, that no longer matters. But it does matter. That's my message here today. And in fact, our survival always, in the earlier days of the human species, it was very clear to see that the practice of natural history was essential for our survival for very pragmatic reasons of acquiring food, knowing which animals would eat us and which ones we could eat, which plants poisoned us and which ones were edible, and when they would be in the right stage of fruiting, and all these kind of things. But I believe that the practice of attentive natural history is still essential to our survival for related kinds of reasons of how it connects us. This practice of attentiveness connects us with the world around us. And all people do it and are able to do it. And my experience for many, many years of working with learners of all different ages, backgrounds, and so on, is that even if people haven't done it since they were a toddler, that we are ready to re-engage, and it's the natural thing for us to do. This is from a book that just came out from a biologist at Yale called The Evolution of Beauty, and he in there mentioned something similar, and he actually had this idea that bird watching, the practice of bird watching, is perhaps one of the first things that the human mind engaged in, again, in these kind of ways of delineating between different shapes, patterns, and so on. Okay, I already mentioned Pliny the Elder in the original Historia Naturalis in the 1st century AD, but you can go back further in time, and many other sort of antecedents of this kind of practice before it had that name. Aristotle, for example, was a wonderful observer of animals especially, and documented a lot of that. But you go back further, and pretty much any hunter-gatherer indigenous culture in the world in the past, today, this is what they do, is practice natural history. So this, again, is a fundamental part of being a human being in the world. In fact, I would argue that natural history, the practice of natural history, is the oldest continuous human endeavor in the world, and in fact, that there have never been people without natural history. You can't be a human being and not do this. It's what we're designed to do. However, it has been in decline, and so it's also true that at this moment in the history of our species is the sort of aberrant historical moment in the arc of our species when the smallest proportion of our species engages in attentiveness to the world around us. So, in other words, we are living in a time when there's the least natural history per capita, you might say, of any time in the history of our species. So why does that matter? Well, I'll try to explain that in a few different ways. One is, I wrote this a number of years ago, kind of just in passing in another book project, that we are what we pay attention to. Actually, wrote that in a big hurry. without thinking about it too much. And then the more I thought about it, I realized I think that's actually like true. And I've thought about that a lot since, that we are, and I think from a sort of neurological, psychological basis, there's a lot of literal truth in that as well. But our consciousness becomes what we pay attention to in many ways. So what do we pay attention to in our daily lives, in our culture, mass culture today? Well, we pay a lot of attention to celebrity, a very interesting concept. We pay attention to our little screens that we all carry around increasingly. And this has real ramifications on how we perceive the world, not just because we're kind of checked out from our friends and looking at a screen, but because it's a two-dimensional surface instead of a three-dimensional world, and we're, instead of shifting scales all the time, we're looking at the same distance. This has serious ramifications for how our minds work. But we have choices about what we pay attention to. Again, different things in any place, but even in the hearts of cities, there's always fascinating things that we can pay attention to. Here is a ribs of a saguaro in southern Arizona, but again, you can look at anything else. And so, in a real perhaps oversimplified way, I would suggest that there's three broad categories of reasons why natural history matters. And I'll go through them one at a time. The first of those is that natural history is the roots of all natural sciences. That we can't actually understand the world in any kind of theoretical kind of understanding if we don't do a really, really good and careful job of paying attention and making sure that we're seeing the world the way it really is and not the way we're projecting it to be. So, and of course in academia, as many of you know, in the sciences, certain kinds of sciences are valued or rewarded much more than others, so that theoretical advances, for example, are what get the tenure promotions and get the big grants and so on and so on. But and so for that reason, that's one of the reasons that in academia, especially, natural history in recent decades was sort of downplayed in a way because there was a big emphasis on the big theories. But if you look at almost any important theoretical advance, and I'm going to give some examples from ecology, which is my background, they're almost always coming from field naturalists who spent an immense amount of time checking out the real world very carefully. This is E.O. Wilson turning over logs to look at ants. But the classic example, both Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace independently coming up with the whole idea of evolution through natural selection, both incredibly great and dedicated field naturalists. An important idea in the last several decades, the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. Again, E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur put this idea together. Again, both naturalists. Ideas of how ecological communities are put together, and the whole notion of keystone species that many of you are probably familiar with came from these folks, among others, Robert Payne and Paul Dayton, looking at starfish initially. Again, dedicated naturalists. So you can't have effective or insightful science without, at least natural sciences, without a practice of natural history to undergird it. It's the foundation. What about conservation, sort of explicitly trying to save the world? Well, again, you can't have effective conservation without accurate natural history. How can you know what species needs saving or what to do about a species if you don't even know who's out there or how many there are or where they are or what kind of landscapes are most threatened or what's the extent of a cottonwood willow forest or whatever it may be? And in fact, in a really, really pragmatic way, in the United States, the Endangered Species Act, to make a petition to list a species under the Endangered Species Act, you have to provide a lot of natural history information to document the need for protecting that species. So again, you can't have effective conservation without the natural history. And there's been many wonderful elders in the field. I know all of you here. I know the fellow in the middle. I've been hearing about Aldo Leopold a lot, which I love hearing. That's also John Wesley Powell and Rachel Carson, again, all wonderful field naturalists who had incredible insights and incredible importance in conservation practice based on that. So, and part of the idea with conservation and why it matters is not just what we know, but it's because of what we feel. Because if we want to save landscapes or species or ourselves, just an accumulation of facts and information doesn't do that for us. Our human behavior is changed more readily by what we feel than by what we know. And climate change is a wonderful example of that, and that the film clip that we just saw a few minutes ago was a wonderful example of trying to invoke feeling into that idea that how many countless articles and papers and books have we read about climate change and the doomsday scenarios, but when you get some emotion involved, those are the kind of things that tend to contribute to actual conservation or change in behavior. And natural history is what tends to do that for us more than theory. Okay, and then the third of the main reasons here is what has become more and more important to me, and what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about is that natural history, the practice of natural history, I believe, is an essential pillar of making us who we are, of our very humanity. And I'll say it bluntly: when we practice natural history, we are better people. And I'll try to explain why here a little bit. And we're also tend to be happier and more engaged and people because of becoming having a larger context of what the world is, and not just looking into the mirror of humanness. So for many years, I have taught field natural history for many years in many different contexts, but after a while I started trying to practice natural history on the practice of natural history. I started to try to see what kind of human behavior did I notice in those who were practicing, and so at times I engaged my students at Prescott College in this and just would ask them after, towards the end of a course when they'd been learning some of these skills, how do you feel different, if at all, than you did before? And I started to document that and began to see that there was really some wonderful common patterns year after year. And I'll talk about a few of these. So humility is perhaps one of the most important. When one is practicing natural history and suddenly finds themselves next to the track of a grizzly bear, it is hard to feel as arrogant as one did the moment before. And of course, humility is something that is sorely lacking in certain parts of our world these days, not to be talking about Washington, D.C. or anything, but so we can all use more of this. And again, humility is when an orca suddenly emerges out of nowhere and is next to your boat, and that animal is larger than the boat, then one has some reassessment of who's in charge and what is the scope of reality. But again, these kind of things can happen without going out into, in this case, the Gulf of California. One could go to Southern Africa, as my friend did here. Frankly, if I saw that, I would not be creeping up close. I would probably be running the other way. But again, humility. And humility does not necessarily have to come from seeing big, fierce animals. One can go into a place like this where we see an ancient canyon and stillness that we are not used to encountering, and it helps us to reassess who we are. Or we're walking along a cove in this case Alaska, but many coastal areas, and suddenly we hear a blow of a cetacean, and we're brought into a whole new state of awakenedness. Or this is something that I only experienced one time, but this was in a subantarctic island, and this is incredibly rare to see this blue ice, which means, and the reason it gets blue is because it's buried at the bottom of a huge stack of ice, and over thousands of years, all the oxygen is compressed out of the ice, which is what makes it look white, is all the air in there, and then only very, very occasionally it pops out, and we see it like this. I was on a ship with passengers from over 20 countries speaking many different languages, and everybody was racing to the rails of the ship and just almost speechless watching this moment, which we were just very lucky to see. So natural history inspires us. As some of us talked about this afternoon, the inspiration is literally like a breathing in of the world. So again, this attentiveness, we breathe in the world with intention as we pay attention. And I have found, again, I've worked with a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds for a long time, and to me, the sense of joy that comes from this and from engaging with the delight of seeing how crazy and wonderful and unpredictable so much in this world is, that comes from the practice of natural history, is at its heart joyful for so many people, and surprising. And what I began to notice after a while that many of us were noticing at the ends of days exploring in a natural history sense that our faces were sore because our jaws were sore from smiling and laughing so much. Natural history, I think, fosters an expanded sense of self from just a self of me standing here inside this boundary of skin, but into an expanded sense of ecological self by, again, the paying attention outwardly and inwardly. And that is directly tied into a sense of compassion, which is literally feeling with, is what compassion means. And the more closely we pay attention to others, the more we're able to feel with them and have compassion for them and thus care about them. I believe that natural history also fosters hope because we engage in endless examples that are fascinating, that are beautiful, that are exhilarating. Sometimes they're scary, sometimes they're horrible, but they help us realize that there's so much more to the world than just the world that the mass media encourages us to focus on. So now to the tying in more directly to the theme of this conference is, and what I have been paying attention to more and more just in the last few years, that natural history has the capacity, I believe, to heal, and that the healing is reciprocal or can be reciprocal, which is to say, and this is just a quote from the book that Melanie mentioned, that when we love the world, we can love ourselves, and vice versa. That it's hard to love ourselves if we hate the world, and it's hard to love, and vice versa. So I started checking out. I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a physician, but I started to delve into the literatures from those fields more and more. And I was kind of blown away by how rapidly expanding those literatures are. Pretty quickly, I had trouble keeping up with it. But these are just some of the things that I found, and I'll go give you a few details on some of these. But the literature, the professional peer-reviewed literatures documenting some of these things that many of us feel intuitively, yes, I feel better when I go out there, has been documented in so many different ways, and these are some of the things. So, for example, this is what Derek, the very same paper that Derek was talking about this morning, and he did a wonderful job of explaining that. So I won't actually say any more about that. But there's many different or the first of the papers here is the one that Derek was talking about. But many different papers documenting the fact of immersion in nature. Reducing depression, anxiety, and so on. Oops, okay. This was an interesting one, a paper that talked about what they call kinder behaviors. Again, immersion in nature, promoting generosity and trust. And they were looking at different groups of people and documenting using sort of standard psychological measures for some of these things, and seeing in groups or in people that were immersed in nature, kinder behavior. There's also things looking at immune function in human bodies at the cellular level. So we're talking about physiological examination of people and what change happens in immersion in nature, in this case from what's referred to as forest bathing, a term that is quite common in some other parts of the world, only now catching on in the United States, but essentially going out and immersing yourself in the world. In this study, they documented even that they were looking at the anti-cancer proteins, and there was more of them when people were doing forest bathing, immersed in the world, immersed in nature. So we can protect ourselves from cancer just by going for a walk. And if you're to boil that down to the core of it, this was a really interesting one. That. Some researchers were looking at urban areas, and in this case, they were actually looking at Toronto, Ontario, and they were doing a whole bunch of different psychological and also medical health kinds of examination of lots of different people, and they were correlating that with different neighborhoods within Toronto, and correlating with the simple factor of how many trees per block, essentially, or they had some grid like that. And what they found is if you had more trees in the per unit area in the city, very urban area, but just with more trees, that there was cardio metabolic function changed in a way that was equivalent to being richer and younger, as far as comparisons with other kinds of peer groups. So. And that's, if you want to sort of sum up the American dream, there you have it right there. You can get richer and younger just by having more trees in your neighborhood, even in the heart of a very, very large city. This was a study that was actually done on an Outward Bound course, doing before and after comparisons with people. Just from 4 days, there was a 50% improvement in resolution of problem solving and creativity. So again, these are just a few examples of what, as I say, is an immense and rapidly growing sets of literature about this, but there's definitely something there, as several of the panelists this morning were discussing as well, and has come up in many different ways. And but there's the idea here is in part that even if people don't care about birds or butterflies or bears, we should care about immersion in nature and protecting the potential for that, because it's good for us in the most selfish way possible. And I think there's a lot of power in that to bring a lot of different people together. So I wanted to mention my organization, the Natural History Institute, is taking the lead in, but working with a number of partner organizations on this, having a national, we're calling it a confluence, but a conference, in 13 months from now in Sedona, Arizona, on this idea of reciprocal healing. There's a few flyers out there on the table, but if you're interested in this or actually in anything else that the Institute is doing, there's a sign-up sheet for a mail list right out there, and we'd love to have you kind of join our sense of community. And my sense from being here for a couple of days is there's lots of potential partners and collaborators sitting in this room and throughout this conference. I'd love to talk with anybody who's interested in that. In fact, this next weekend when I'm home, there's partners coming in from both coasts to do some intensive planning on where we're going to take this. Okay, natural history is oftentimes looked at as sort of a lightweight subset. In many academic institutions, primarily, natural history is sometimes looked at as a sort of lightweight subset of biology or natural sciences, but I think that's actually dead wrong. I think that natural history is something much bigger than science, an integrated wholeness of weaving together science, arts, and the humanities. Wonderful poet who actually lives here in Colorado, Patty Ann Rogers, once wrote this, that without artistic expression, facts remain alien, unpossessed, and with no reverberations in the soul. And none other than Rachel Carson, when she was accepting the National Book Award for the wonderful book, The Sea Around Us, said, "No one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry," which I think is a wonderful statement. Barry Lopez and many other people have pointed out that we really understand, the world through stories. That you could even say that it's a fundamental field mark almost of our species, is that we create stories, we share stories, and we create meaning out of stories. Barry Lopez, wonderful writer, wrote what was ostensibly a children's book called Crow and Weasel, but it's a wise teaching book, I believe. And one of the characters, who you see there, Badger Woman, said this, that sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. So what kind of stories do we tell about nature? As ecologists and scientists, we often tell them in very, very careful, meticulous ways like you see here, and I'm not putting that down for a minute. I think it plays an incredibly important role in communicating knowledge, but it doesn't tend to touch the heart. And so what other kinds of stories might we tell? I guess my concern is that scientists too often leave it at this and don't take the next step to translate this into other kinds of stories that are more meaningful or more connecting for the human heart than this. And often those kind of stories, the kind of stories that connect with people are those that are rooted in natural history. Wow, have you seen this chick of this albatross? Or wow, did you see the mouth on that leopard seal? And man, I don't want to be there. I saw this grizzly bear taking apart a deer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, in fact, I know people who are high-ranking officials in large conservation organizations, and they're into natural history for a mercenary reason, and I'm not criticizing that, because they have realized that natural history, getting people out and looking at things, is how they get donations, actually, for the work of an organization like the Nature Conservancy, for example, whereas all the scientific papers in the world might not do that, but natural history lights us up. Okay. So Melanie mentioned this book. I'm going to end by just reading a couple short excerpts from the book that will hopefully tie some of this together, and then we'll move on to the next thing. So I might, just for context, I edited an anthology about 7 years ago called The Way of Natural History, which brought together 20-some authors that ranged from Zen roshis to rock and roll guitar players and everything in between, about how natural history figured and played an important role in both their work and their play. And that was a really fun project. And I decided to follow that up with this, but to have a more of a leaning towards this idea of healing and again, the idea that even if you don't care so much about all that stuff out there, that you might pay attention to this because it actually helps us. And so some of the essays, again, there's 20-some contributors, but there's some of them are healers, psychologists and so on, and some of them are the healed, people who recovered from serious kinds of injuries, accidents, psychological concerns, etc. So first, I'm going to read from two short excerpts from two different things here. This entry is the opening to the book, just a page and a half, which I'm not even going to read all of that. It sort of provides context for the book. This book unabashedly declares that love for our biologically and culturally diverse world is a fundamental virtue and imperative. Humans are born to practice natural history, simply put, to pay attention to nature, and are physically, emotionally, and socially healthier when we do. Collectively, the contributors explore this notion that attentiveness to nature remains an essential pathway to sanity and health for both individuals and societies. Ecologists, psychologists, educators, poets, novelists, artists, researchers and creators, theorists and practitioners, the healers and the healed ask, how can nature heal us as individuals and communities? How does practicing natural history lead to healthier lives? And why does deep engagement with nature help us love the world? From different nations, cultures, professions, religious traditions, and approaches to engaging the world, these writers explore how natural history, a practice of intentional focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy, is, at its core, the practice of falling in love with the world. When we pay attention, we connect. When we connect, we become more whole. The words whole, that's with a W, and heal derive from the same Old English and Proto-Germanic roots. For at least 700 years, our language has recognized that wholeness and healing sprout from the same source. So, natural history, a practice that leads us toward wholeness and healing as we make our way within this world shot through with wildness, that ineffable wisp of life force, the sinew that braids us together. Nature, love, medicine, healing ourselves and the world. And finally, I'm going to read my own essay contributing to this. Is called Our Deepest Affinity, and I'm just going to read the last few paragraphs of this essay. It's the final night of a week-long group backpack into Red Earth. After a late supper and lingering conversation, two of us lay back, stunned into horizontality by the night sky. In this canyon of smooth stone, deep in the heart of one of the largest roadless areas in North America, our eyes gaze intently where they rarely focus, upward. The dome of stars is phenomenally textured with vast depth visible within the Milky Way. Swirls and eddies of pulsating light contrast with the velvet black of infinity. Arcing downward, the gaudiest shooting star I've ever seen blazes brilliantly for a full 20 seconds as it angles toward Earth. Its long tail remains gleaming even after I close my eyes. It's a brief interlude of extended psyche as our minds momentarily stretch beyond their usual boundaries, a sense of delighted union with the larger forces of not only this world of green, but the universe that surrounds it, and better for sharing it with a close friend. Lying face up to the heavens, dazzled, humbled, entranced by the endless array of light, provokes a fundamental feeling of kinship with people through times and cultures. We all look up and wonder. And on these sandstone slabs, in front of this long-inhabited alcove, near 1,000-year-old petroglyphs and discarded clay pots, we see the same framing of the universe as our ancestors, unchanged through human time, but for the occasional steady scoot of a tiny satellite's light. In these singular moments, we are the outbreath of galaxies. Thank you.